All characters in the story are over the age of 18. When I moved into the family home at 14, I didn't expect much. Being adopted into a new family after bouncing between foster homes was supposed to be my ticket to stability, not connection. But when I met Emma and Margaret, I knew this wasn't going to be just any family. Emma was the perfect sister, or so everyone said. At 18, she was effortlessly confident, with a quick wit and a beauty that seemed unfair to the rest of the world. Margaret, her mother and my new stepmother, was the polar opposite of my dad. She was warm, inviting, and the type of woman who somehow made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. But back then, I was just trying to adjust. Being the adopted kid meant I kept my head down, focusing on surviving high school and blending into the chaos of my new family. Fast forward to now. I'm 22, finishing my last year of college while living back at home. Emma is 26 and works in PR. She still lives here too, saving up for her own place. Margaret, despite being in her early 40s, has the kind of youthful energy that always made her the center of attention. At first, I told myself it was admiration. How could it not be? Emma was brilliant, sharp, and beautiful in a way that made it impossible not to notice. Margaret, on the other hand, was everything a mother figure should be, except I couldn't ignore the way her kindness sometimes lingered too long when it came to me. It started subtly, as things like this often do. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room with Emma. Dad and Margaret were out for dinner, leaving us with the house to ourselves. "Want to watch something?" she asked, scrolling through Netflix. "Sure," I replied, sitting at the far end of the couch. She picked a thriller, something tense and gripping. As the movie played, I couldn't help but notice how close she was sitting, closer than usual. When the first jump scare hit, she clutched my arm, laughing at her own reaction. "You're jumpier than I thought," I teased. "Shut up," she said, smirking. But she didn't let go of my arm. It was small, innocuous even, but the electricity of her touch lingered. Later that week, Margaret caught me in the kitchen as I was grabbing a late-night snack. She was wearing a loose cardigan over her pajamas, her hair slightly tousled. "You're up late," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She leaned against the counter, studying me. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just busy with school." She nodded but didn't look convinced. "You know, you can talk to me, right? About anything." "Thanks," I said, giving her a small smile. As I turned to leave, her hand brushed against mine. Just for a moment, but long enough to make me pause. When I looked back, her gaze lingered, something unreadable in her expression. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house grew. Emma started spending more time with me, watching movies, helping me with school projects, finding excuses to hang out. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to be finding reasons to check in with me more often, her concern bordering on something I couldn't quite name. One evening, the four of us sat down for dinner together. The conversation was lively, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's glances lingered too long, or that Emma's laughter was a little too loud at my jokes. I told myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something was shifting, something none of us were ready to acknowledge. Life at home became a careful balancing act. Emma and I grew closer in ways that felt impossible to define. She'd rest her head on my shoulder during a movie or steal fries off my plate, her casual intimacy blurring the line between sibling affection and something more. Meanwhile, Margaret's attention became harder to ignore. Her questions felt deeper, her smiles warmer, and the way her hand might brush my back as she walked by felt deliberate. One night, Emma and I stayed up late working on her portfolio for a major PR pitch. She was stressed, her usually poised demeanor cracking under the pressure. "I just don't know if it's good enough," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's great," I said, leaning over her laptop to show her a few tweaks. "You've got this." She looked at me then, her eyes softening. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Before I could respond, she hugged me. A tight, lingering hug that made my heart race. When she pulled back, her face was close to mine, her breath warm against my cheek. "Thanks," she whispered. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Her lips parted slightly, and I felt myself leaning closer. But the sound of Margaret's footsteps upstairs snapped us both back to reality. "I should get to bed," Emma said quickly, her voice tight. "Yeah." I agreed, my pulse pounding. The next day, I couldn't focus. My mind replayed the moment with Emma, the way her body had felt against mine, the way she'd looked at me. But guilt twisted in my stomach. This was wrong, wasn't it? Margaret must have noticed something was off because she cornered me in the kitchen that evening. "You've been distracted lately," she said, leaning against the counter. "Anything you want to talk about?" "No, just school stuff." I lied, avoiding her gaze. She stepped closer, her tone softening. "Caleb, you don't have to keep everything bottled up. I'm here for you." Her hand rested lightly on my arm, and for a moment, I let myself believe she meant it. But the way her thumb brushed against my skin felt too intimate, too deliberate. "Thanks," I mumbled, pulling away. She looked at me then, her expression unreadable. "You know, you've grown into a remarkable young man. Your dad and I are really proud of you." "Thanks," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. As she walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. Later that night, I found myself in the living room with Emma again. She was scrolling through her phone, her legs tucked under her on the couch. "You're quiet tonight," she said, glancing at me. "Just thinking," I replied, unsure of how much to share. She set her phone down, studying me. "What's going on with you lately? You've been weird." I hesitated, then blurted out, "Do you ever feel like this house is complicated?" She raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "Just complicated." She laughed softly. "That's vague, even for you." Before I could explain, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes flicking between us. "You two still up?" "Just talking," Emma said casually. Margaret lingered for a moment before smiling. "Don't stay up too late." When she left, Emma gave me a curious look. "Complicated, huh? You have no idea," I muttered. The next week felt like walking a tightrope. Emma and I continued to spend time together, but every interaction carried an unspoken tension. Her hand brushing mine during a conversation, the way she'd lean against me while showing me something on her phone. It all felt too familiar, too loaded with meaning. Margaret's behavior, on the other hand, grew more overt. She started complimenting me more often. Little comments about how well I was growing into myself or how lucky any girl would be to have me. Her words seemed innocent enough, but the way she said them, soft, lingering, made it clear there was something more beneath the surface. One evening, after dinner, Margaret called me into the living room. Emma had gone out with friends, and Dad was in his office, leaving just the two of us. "Caleb," she said, patting the couch beside her. "Sit with me for a bit." I hesitated but sat down, keeping a polite distance. "I wanted to check in," she said, her tone warm. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, just busy with school," I said, keeping my answer vague. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I care about you, Caleb." "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile. She reached out, placing her hand on mine. "I mean it. You're part of this family, and I want you to feel supported." Her touch lingered longer than it should have, her thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. My throat tightened, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that," I said finally, pulling my hand away under the guise of adjusting my position. She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe? The next day, Emma was unusually quiet. She spent most of the afternoon in her room, only emerging to grab a quick snack before retreating again. Concerned, I knocked on her door. "Come in," she called softly. She was sitting on her bed, surrounded by papers and her laptop, her hair tied up messily. She looked tired, her usual energy dimmed. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping inside. "Just work stuff," she said, gesturing to the mess around her. "It's overwhelming sometimes." I sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep some space between us. Need help? She looked at me, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're sweet, but I think I just need to vent. Vent away, I said, leaning back on my hands. She started talking about her boss, her clients, and all the little frustrations that had piled up. As she spoke, I couldn't help but admire her. The way her eyes lit up when she got passionate, the way her hands moved as she gestured. Sorry, she said after a while, laughing lightly. I'm rambling. Don't apologize, I said. I like listening to you. Her smile faltered slightly, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, heavy with everything we weren't saying. Caleb, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward before I could stop myself. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. When our lips met, it was like the world stopped. The kiss was hesitant at first, both of us testing the waters, but it quickly deepened. Her hand found its way to my face, her fingers curling against my jaw as she pressed closer. When we finally pulled apart, her cheeks were flushed, her breathing uneven. We shouldn't, she started, but her voice lacked conviction. I know, I said, my heart racing. But even as we said the words, neither of us moved to put more space between us. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the moment over and over. My feelings for Emma were undeniable now, but so was the guilt. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the memory of Margaret's touch, her lingering glances. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it all together. After that kiss, everything between Emma and me shifted. The unspoken tension that had simmered for weeks finally boiled over. We couldn't look at each other the same way anymore, and every casual touch felt loaded with meaning. Emma tried to avoid me the next day, but our paths inevitably crossed. She was in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in. Morning, I said cautiously. Hey, she replied, her back to me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and awkward. I hesitated before stepping closer. Emma, about last night. Don't, she interrupted, turning to face me. We can't talk about it, Caleb. We can't. She stopped abruptly, her gaze darting past me. I turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, a mug in her hand and a curious expression on her face. Everything okay? Margaret asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Yeah, just talking, Emma said quickly, brushing past me and leaving the room. Margaret watched her go, then turned her attention to me. You two seem tense lately. Something going on? No, nothing, I said, avoiding her gaze. She stepped closer, her presence unnervingly warm. You know, Caleb, you don't have to hide anything from me. I'm here for you. Her hand brushed my arm as she spoke, her touch lingering just long enough to make my pulse quicken. Thanks, I mumbled, pulling away. I should get going. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret knew more than she let on. That night, Emma knocked on my door. She looked nervous, her arms crossed over her chest. Can we talk? She asked. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let her in. She paced the room for a moment before sitting on the edge of my bed. Whatever this is between us, it can't happen, Caleb. It's too complicated. I know, I said, sitting beside her. But that doesn't make it go away. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you feel guilty? Every second, I admitted. But I also can't stop thinking about you. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. This is such a mess. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. We both froze. Caleb? Margaret's voice called softly from the hallway. Emma's eyes widened, and she scrambled to her feet, whispering, Don't tell her I'm here. I nodded, and she slipped into my closet just as the door opened. Margaret stepped inside, her expression curious. Everything okay? She asked, her gaze sweeping the room. Yeah, fine, I said, trying to sound casual. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. You seem nervous. I'm just tired, I said quickly. Margaret studied me for a moment longer, then smiled. All right, good night, Caleb. When she left, Emma emerged from the closet, her face pale. This is getting dangerous, she said. I know, I replied, my heart still racing. But even as we stood there, the gravity between us pulled me closer. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was falling for Emma, and the risk only seemed to make it worse. The days after Emma hid in my closet were a blur of paranoia and tension. Margaret's presence seemed to grow heavier, her lingering glances and probing questions making it clear she suspected something. Meanwhile, Emma and I avoided each other as much as possible, though it only made the air in the house feel suffocating. One evening, Dad announced a weekend trip for him and Margaret to visit an old friend out of town. Just a couple of days, he said, pouring himself a drink. You two can hold down the fort, right? Emma and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance but nodded. When the weekend arrived and Dad and Margaret left, the house felt both liberating and suffocating. The absence of their watchful eyes was a relief, but the silence amplified everything Emma and I had been avoiding. That evening, she came into the living room, where I was pretending to watch TV. Can we talk? She asked, standing in the doorway. Yeah, I said, muting the screen. She sat down on the couch, her body angled away from me. We need to figure out what we're doing, Caleb. This can't keep happening. I know, I said, my chest tightening. She looked at me, her eyes glistening. I care about you. A lot. But if anyone finds out, they won't, I said quickly. You don't know that, she said, her voice breaking. Margaret already suspects something, and Dad. Margaret, I interrupted, sitting up straighter. Why do you think she suspects anything? Emma hesitated, then shook her head. Never mind. It doesn't matter. The point is, we need to stop this before it blows up in our faces. I wanted to argue, to tell her that what we had was worth the risk. But before I could, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from Margaret. Are you alone? What is it? Emma asked, her brow furrowing. Nothing, I said, locking the phone. Just a spam text. But the unease in my stomach lingered. The next day, while Emma was out running errands, Margaret called. I just wanted to check in, she said, her voice warm. How's everything at the house? Fine, I said, keeping my tone neutral. You're not getting into any trouble, are you? She teased, but there was an edge to her words. Of course not, I replied. She laughed softly. Good. I'd hate to think you were keeping secrets from me. Caleb, you know you can trust me, right? Yeah, I said, my throat tight. After the call ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was playing a game I didn't fully understand. That evening, when Emma returned, she seemed distant. I wanted to press her on why she thought Margaret suspected us, but she brushed me off. I just have a feeling, okay? She said, exasperated. Emma, if she knows, we need to figure out what to do, I said. Or maybe we just stop before it's too late, she said, her voice breaking. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Margaret walked in, a bag in her hand. Hey, she said, her gaze flicking between us. Trip got cut short. Emma stiffened beside me, her expression carefully neutral. That's great, she said, forcing a smile. Margaret smiled back, but her eyes lingered on me. I missed this place, she said softly. I missed you both. Her words hung in the air, their meaning just ambiguous enough to make my pulse race. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Margaret. Come talk to me. Just us. I stared at the screen, dread and curiosity warring inside me. The text from Margaret sat on my screen like a ticking time bomb. Come talk to me. Just us. My gut twisted as I debated what to do. If I ignored her, she might push harder. If I went, I risked walking into something I wasn't ready to handle. After a long moment, I found myself standing outside her bedroom door. I knocked lightly, and her voice called out, Come in. The room was dimly lit, soft golden light spilling from a bedside lamp. Margaret was sitting on the edge of the bed in a loose sweater and leggings, her hair down in soft waves. She looked up and gave me a small, almost shy smile. "Thanks for coming," she said, patting the spot beside her. I hesitated, then sat down, keeping a careful distance. "What's going on?" she sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. I feel like we've been a little out of sync lately. You've been quiet, distant. I wanted to make sure everything's okay." "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. She tilted her head, studying me. "Caleb, I'm not blind. I can see that something's been weighing on you, and I want to help." Her hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I pulled back instinctively. "I'm fine," I said again, standing quickly. "Just stressed with school and stuff." Margaret stood as well, stepping closer. "You don't have to be afraid of me, you know? I care about you, Caleb. I've always cared." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my heart pounding. She was so close now, her eyes searching mine. "I should go," I muttered, stepping toward the door. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice stopping me in my tracks. "You're not alone in feeling this." I froze, my mind racing. Before I could respond, I heard Emma's voice from the hallway. "Caleb." Margaret stepped back just as the door opened, and Emma appeared. Her eyes flicked between us, suspicion clouding her expression. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Nothing," I said quickly, brushing past her. "Good night." I didn't stop walking until I was safely in my room, my pulse racing. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Emma barely spoke to me, her cold demeanor making it clear she didn't believe my explanation from the night before. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, moving through the day with her usual warmth and charm. By the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I found Emma in the backyard, sitting on the porch swing with a mug of tea. "Emma, we need to talk," I said, sitting beside her. She didn't look at me. "About what?" "About last night," I said, my voice low. She sighed, setting her mug down. "Is there something going on with you and Margaret?" "No," I said quickly. "Of course not." She finally turned to face me, her eyes filled with hurt. "You've been acting weird around her. And last night, it didn't look like nothing." "It's not what you think," I said, leaning closer. "Emma, I care about you. That hasn't changed." Her expression softened slightly, but the doubt lingered. "Then why does it feel like she's trying to get between us?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Margaret, she's been acting differently lately. I think she knows something's going on, and she's trying to, I don't know, manipulate you?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe," I admitted, "but I'm not letting her. I'm not letting anyone come between us." Emma looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, but if she tries anything else, we need to figure out how to deal with it. Together." "Agreed," I said, relief washing over me. But as I sat there with Emma, I couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control, and that Margaret wasn't going to back down quietly. The next few days were a balancing act of tension and avoidance. Emma and I kept our distance whenever Margaret was around, but her watchful eyes made it clear she hadn't let go of whatever she was playing at. One evening, as Emma was out running errands, Margaret cornered me in the living room. "Caleb," she said softly, sitting beside me on the couch, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." I stiffened, my instincts screaming to get up and leave. "About what?" Her hand rested lightly on my knee, the touch sending a jolt through me. "I'm not blind. I see the way you look at Emma, and I see the way she looks at you." My stomach twisted. "It's not like that," I said quickly. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You forget, Caleb. I know what it's like to feel drawn to someone you're not supposed to." I froze, my heart pounding. "What are you saying?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm saying that you have a choice to make. You can keep sneaking around with Emma, hoping no one finds out. Or," she paused, her eyes locking onto mine, You can see where this thing between us goes. My mind reeled, her words hitting like a freight train. Margaret, she held up a hand, silencing me. You don't have to answer now, but think about it. I can make things very easy for you, Caleb. Or very complicated. Before I could respond, she stood and left the room, her words echoing in my ears. Margaret's ultimatum consumed my thoughts, but I couldn't bring myself to tell Emma. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and the longer I stayed silent, the more I felt trapped. A few nights later, Emma knocked on my door. She looked nervous, her arms crossed over her chest. Can we talk? She asked. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of my bed, her expression tense. I've been thinking about what you said. About Margaret. What about her? I asked cautiously. I think she's trying to push us apart, Emma said, her voice trembling. She keeps making these little comments, asking questions about us. It's like she's trying to dig for something. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She confronted me, I admitted. Emma's eyes widened. What did she say? She knows about us, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And she gave me an ultimatum. She wants me to choose. Choose, Emma repeated, her voice sharp. She said she could make things easy or complicated. I said, my chest tightening. Emma stood abruptly, pacing the room. This is insane. She's insane. Caleb, we have to tell Dad. I shook my head. We can't. It'll blow everything up. And what happens if we don't? She'll keep pushing, keep manipulating until she gets what she wants. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. Caleb? Margaret's voice called softly from the hallway. Emma's face went pale, and she motioned for me to stay quiet. But Margaret knocked again, her tone more insistent. I know you're in there, she said. We need to talk. Emma whispered. Don't open it. Not yet. But Margaret wasn't giving up. The sound of the doorknob turning sent a chill down my spine. I stood, blocking Emma from view as the door opened. Margaret's gaze swept over the room, landing on Emma behind me. Her smile faltered, and her eyes hardened. Well, she said, her voice icy. This is disappointing. Margaret's gaze flicked between Emma and me, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Margaret closed the door behind her, her expression cold but composed. So, this is how it is, she said, her voice low and sharp. Margaret, I started, but she cut me off with a raised hand. No, I think I've heard enough, she said, her eyes narrowing at Emma. And you? I expected better. Emma stepped forward, her shoulders squared. You don't get to play the victim here, Margaret. You've been trying to manipulate Caleb for weeks. What exactly is your plan? To tear this family apart? Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. Oh, don't be so dramatic. I was trying to protect Caleb from making a mistake. Like getting involved with someone who can't possibly give him what he needs. Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. You mean me? His stepsister? That's rich coming from you. You're his stepmother. Margaret turned to me, her voice softening. Caleb, you know I only want what's best for you. I've always cared about you, maybe more than I should. But this, she gestured between Emma and me, is going to ruin everything. I stared at her, my heart pounding. Margaret, you don't get to make that decision for me. She blinked, clearly taken aback. What are you saying? I'm saying that this is my life, and I'm done letting you manipulate me. I turned to Emma, my chest tightening. I care about you. I don't know what this means for us, but I know it's real. Emma's eyes softened, and she reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. Margaret's face darkened, her calm mask slipping. You're going to regret this, she said coldly. Both of you. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, leaving us in stunned silence. The next morning, Dad returned home. Margaret acted as though nothing was wrong, but Emma and I knew the peace wouldn't last. Over the following days, Margaret's demeanor shifted between icy silence and passive-aggressive remarks. Emma and I decided we couldn't keep living like this. One evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, we sat Dad down in the living room. Dad, I began, my voice trembling. We need to tell you something. His brow furrowed. What's going on? Emma took a deep breath. It's about Margaret. She's been inappropriate. She's been trying to manipulate Caleb and me. His expression darkened. What do you mean, inappropriate? She's been crossing boundaries, I said carefully. She's tried to come between Emma and me, and she's made it clear she has feelings for me. Dad's face went pale, his hands clenching into fists. Are you serious? I wish I weren't, I said. For a moment he said nothing, his jaw tightening. Then he stood abruptly. I need to talk to her. No, Emma said quickly, grabbing his arm. Not tonight. Please, just think about what we've said. He hesitated, then nodded, his face a storm of emotions. A week later, Margaret moved out. Dad had confronted her privately, and though he didn't share the details, it was clear their marriage was over. Emma and I took things slow after that, careful not to let the chaos of the past weeks dictate our future. We knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, the house felt like it could be a home again. As for Margaret, I never saw her again. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the look in her eyes when she realized I wasn't choosing her. It was a mix of anger, betrayal, and something almost like sorrow. Emma and I didn't have all the answers, but we had each other. And in the end, that was enough.